Good morning, dear listeners and viewers, especially those who are following us on YouTube. On this day of our conference on migrants, displaced people, and refugees and global solidarity, on the second day, and this is the Africa Hub, which is based in Nairobi, and the other hubs are the Global Ministry University in California and the Interreligious Forum from the European Hub based in Frankfurt. This hub is led by Rita Mazzoldi as the moderator of this panel. Thank you, Rita, for putting up this panel. Forum from the European Hub based in. There is an echo.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much. Rita is a PhD candidate at Sangaza University in the Institute of Social Transformation. So thank you very much, Rita, for your panel. Now you can introduce the panelists.
Okay. Good morning, viewers, both here in Kenya and Nairobi, and in the other parts of the world. You're very welcome to this panel. We have 3 panel members present here at the moment. I would like to do the following. I will introduce the panel. After I introduce the panel, I will kind of present 2 slides to set the tone for this meeting. So let me start with the panel. Our first speaker is a refugee. You will see the name Deborah. This person will speak off camera for security purposes, but will explain and set out the experience of a refugee. Okay. And the second speaker will be David Muzana, who is a lawyer. He is the principal for Refugee Law Network, and he is very active working for refugee rights and human rights. And then finally, we have Musaki Mumo, who is an officer from the CPJ, which is an organization that actually looks after a special category of refugees or people at risk, which are journalists. We are also expecting a colleague from Amnesty International. Person hasn't logged in yet, but if he does, I will introduce him also. Now, if I may, I want to take you to some slides to set the tone for this meeting. Just bear with me as I move to share screen. Okay. So let me know if you can see it. Can you see the screen? Can you see the slides?
We can see, or I can see, it says we're viewing your screen, but I can only see that it's dark. I cannot see the slides. I don't know about everyone else.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that. Let me just, there's always a problem when you try to do this. Okay, let me just try again. Okay, I seem to not be able to share it. Select the screen. Can you see it now? Can you see the screen? Can you see the screen now?
I can see a screen, a PowerPoint presentation.
I confirm visual.
You confirm visuals.
Yes.
Okay. Now let me just get back. Let me get to the, okay. So you confirm, you see it?
That's correct.
Yes, I can see it
Rita.
also on the YouTube. Okay, thank you very much for that assistance. And I'm sorry, viewers, for the little bit of a hiccup. So what I want to share with you is, for example, that if we look at our region, going from Djibouti, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, we have a total of about 5 million refugees. But we have almost internally displaced people for various conflicts related issues, climate change related issue. We almost have 28 million people displaced. So I think these figures are potentially very large and difficult for us to really grasp. But I think if you look at the next slide, right, you see very dark purple, Sudan. Sudan alone has 11 million internally displaced people. I think an important message is that most of the people in Africa who are displaced, etc., are actually not traveling to Europe or other places. So, you know, Sudan and DRC, big conflicts, lots of internally displaced people. Ethiopia also, Kenya not so much. And then there's the overlap of refugees. And you see the same countries who are actually in trouble because of internal conflicts are also hosting a large number of refugees. So I just want people to keep that in mind as we move on and listen to Deborah and her testimony, and then we move to the next speakers. The way we will approach this is we will listen to the speakers. Each speaker has about 15 minutes. And then after all the speakers have completed their presentations or their sharing, we will have question time. Thank you very much. I will now stop sharing, which is also difficult. Okay, it's taking a little while to stop sharing. Deborah, can you go ahead and start your presentation?
Thank you, Rita.
And speak loudly so we can hear you very well.
Thank you, Rita. Distinguished guests, my name is Deborah, and I'm a refugee living in Kenya. Today, I want to share with you the real challenges that we refugees face in our daily lives, based on my experience. As we know, every refugee's journey begins with difficult choices. For many of us, we fled the system of indefinite national service and political persecution. We left behind our homes, our families, and the life we knew, and carrying with us only hopes for safety and a better future. Allow me to share with you the main challenges we face as refugees. First, there is a complex issue of documentation. Many refugees struggle with obtaining and maintaining proper legal status. Without proper papers, even simple tasks can become nearly impossible. For example, obtaining a SIM card, a bank account, registering for school, or even moving freely within the city can be a challenge. The process of refugee status determination, for example, in Kenya, it takes years. leaving many of us in a state of uncertainty. Also, there is a big challenge with the address. When refugees seek asylum seeker in Kenya, the address is documented in one of the refugee camps, even if the asylum seeker is residing in Nairobi. Then it means one cannot be able to apply for ID unless they go to the camp or the address is changed. And changing of the address is a very tough process. This process alone can take so many months, can take even up to 1 year. Second, accessing basic services in our daily lives is a challenge. Although Kenya has been generous in hosting refugees, our health care needs often go unmet. Many refugees cannot afford medical care. For our children, accessing quality education is another hurdle. Continuing education for the adults, like in higher education, is even harder. While they dream of becoming doctors, our children, while they dream of becoming doctors, engineers, teachers, and so on, many face interruptions in their schooling due to displacement. The third challenge, making a living. Finding unemployment is perhaps one of the biggest challenges. Despite many of us, the refugees, having professional qualifications and valuable skills, legal restrictions often prevent us from working in our fields or in our skills. This forces many highly skilled individuals into informal work, struggling to make ends meet. Fourth, housing situation is another pressing concern. Many refugees live in crowded conditions, often paying high rents for basic accommodation. And many still struggle to find affordable and adequate housing amid housing crisis and lack of public or subsidized housing. Landlords sometimes exploit our vulnerable status, and finding affordable, safe housing becomes our constant struggle. The fifth,
Oh,
can you hear me?
yeah, go ahead. We can hear you loud and clear.
Perhaps the most difficult challenge is the emotional burden we carry. Many of us have family members still back home or scattered across different countries. The pain of separation, combined with the trauma of what we fled from, weighs heavily on our mental health. Yet, mental health support services are often unavailable or inaccessible. The sixth challenge is language barriers. Language barriers also make it difficult to communicate properly. For example, in those living in Kenya, for us to communicate effectively with the Kenyan people, we must understand Kiswahili, as they prefer communicating in their language over English. On top of it, even when communicating in English, the accent is another challenge. The seventh challenge, post-traumatic stress and ongoing trauma, usually happen due to trauma from our past experiences and because we have limited access to mental health support, it contributes negatively. However, I don't stand here today just to speak about problems. I also would like to highlight the incredible resilience of refugee communities. Despite these challenges, I see remarkable strength every day. We see for example, refugee women starting small businesses to support their families, young people teaching each other new languages and new skills, communities coming together to support newcomers, and children excelling in school despite all the odds they face. So we need support to create positive change. like support organizations that provide legal aid to refugees, employ refugees when possible, and advocate for their right to work, help combat discrimination by sharing our stories, volunteer as language teachers or mentors, and advocate for policies that protect refugee rights. So, to conclude my speech, no one chooses to become a refugee. We are teachers, doctors, engineers, and students who were forced to flee our homes. All we need is the chance to rebuild our lives with dignity and contribute to our host communities. Refugees are real people, and thank you for listening to our story. Together we can build a more inclusive and understanding society. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Deborah. You just reminded me of something very important. In 2014, the Eritrean Catholic bishops responded to a tragedy in Lampedusa that happened in October 2013, when more than 300 Eritreans drowned. The bishops wrote a pastoral letter, which basically became the bestseller amongst the Eritrean diaspora in general, titled, "Where is Your Brother?" In that letter, the bishops remind us basically of what Fratelli Tutti reminds us, that we are all brothers and sisters. But they are also put out the statement that nobody leaves a land of milk and honey to suffer in exile in a third country. So people who are moving, they are not moving for frivolous reasons. And our Catholic bishops in Eritrea remind us of this, not only in their 2014 letter, but also as early as 2001 in their pastoral letter, "God Loves This Country." They remind us that nobody leaves a land of milk and honey to suffer in exile. Okay, so what we would like to do now is I'll ask David Muthana to please follow on with from what Deborah shared and share your story and your experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, the panelist. I hope I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Oh,
you are very audible.
You very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is David Muthama, an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. We've been practicing refugee law for quite some time. We have a passion. I'm the executive director of an organization by the name Refugee Legal Networks. We are registered in Kenya as a non-profit, and we operate on basically three programs. That is the legal aid that I lead. Then we have research and learning, and then we have advocacy and capacity building. Now, I will talk about experiences briefly that we have gone through, especially in the legal aid program. Of course, Kenya has got a large number, almost 1 million refugees who are registered, and hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers who are yet to receive their recognition as refugees. And the challenge that I have seen, just like my sister Deborah has talked about, is the slowness or the red tape or the bureaucracy in documentation. That has been a major challenge. We have seen many asylum seekers come to our office to seek some sort of intervention between them and the Department of Refugee Services to get their paperwork done. So yes, it is indeed true what Deborah said, that documentation is a major issue. Now, when migrants are not documented, that becomes a problem with regards to their security, access to services, government services, or private services. And this leads to them suffering a lot. That's why we've seen very many come to our office to seek intervention. We also see very many refugees or asylum seekers who end up in trouble with the law simply because they are trying to articulate their problems. For example, we've seen many refugees or asylum seekers try to demonstrate in front of the offices, government offices and UNHCR, and that ends up being a big problem because they get arrested and charged with various misdemeanors, creating disturbance and the likes. And they end up spending time because of lack of representation or lack of enough organizations offering legal aid. They end up spending a lot of time in lockup, in judicial lockup, which of course now makes their problem even worse. We've also seen many refugees and asylum seekers complain about health and access to health. That is a major problem because we do not also have many organizations that give medical help, both general physical health, mentally, psychological, and the likes. Remember, most of these asylum seekers and refugees have fled their country of origin due to various persecution issues that they face. And it is not, just like my colleague, Ms. Rita has said, that it is not the wish of anybody to leave their comfort of their home to go into another country to seek refuge. In fact, one of our slogans at Refugee Legal Networks is that a citizen today is a refugee tomorrow. Because the issue of asylum seeking and crossing over from one country to another is something that is happening in real time. As we speak now, plenty of humanity has crossed from one side to the other side seeking help. It is therefore a reality that a refugee, a citizen today is a refugee tomorrow. And based on that, we approach refugee issues and asylum seekers problems at heart. It is important to note that there is a will in the Kenyan people to assist people within the region, people who are seeking asylum in our country. But we face challenges with those people who feel that our country should not be a safe haven for refugees or asylum seekers. I say this because Kenya, of course, is signatory to various international conventions on the rights of asylum seekers and refugees. We also have very good, elaborate local laws that deal with the procedure of receiving asylum seekers, registering them, and the care that they should get. I'm talking about the Refugee Act of 2021. It's a very recent legislation. Kenya has also followed up with more legal frameworks like the Refugees Regulations of 2024, February 2024, where various regulations on how to deal with matters refugees with regards to their representation, their registration, their security is concerned. So yes, there is a will with the Kenyan people, majority, I believe, to give a safe haven for people who are being persecuted from their country of origin. Nothing could prove this much further better than the legislation that we have with that regard. But we find that we have got people who are, of course, hell-bent or think otherwise. And it's these people that we are always in so to speak, collision with. So our work basically involves representing in court those who are, of course, arrested and don't have or can't afford legal help. We also participate in public interest litigation with regards to matters of refugees. Like currently, we do have a petition which is actively before court, where we are trying to have the court declare a communique that was issued by the Department of Refugee Services to the effect that all refugees and asylum seekers in Kenya must surrender their passports of their country of origin. We, of course, found this to be illegal and against the law, and we are currently in court challenging that decision of the Commissioner of Refugee Services, and we hope this goes well. So we come across a lot of problems that refugees and asylum seekers face, and we do not relent, and we will not stop. We will continue with the goodwill. We will continue receiving complaints. We will continue with the advocacy and capacity building. We will continue with research and learning. I won't talk more than that. Of course, when it comes to the plenary, we'll be happy to take any questions that any of the attendees might have. Otherwise, thank you very much, Rita, for putting up this team. We hope that it goes well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just an intermission, a thought to share. When we look up the data, specifically the data I showed you at the beginning of this panel or this session, when we look at the data that is officially published, the only data that is actually available in Kenya, but also in our neighboring countries, is the data of registered refugees and asylum seekers. A lot of the people like David, which from Refugee Law Network, or the other legal aid services like Refugee Consortium Kenya, RCK, Kito Sharia, that are dealing with, are often not registered. So there is a large number of people for whom we have no data. We also have no data, for example, of the number of people who are arrested by the magistrates at the borders and appear before the magistrates because they are deemed to be undocumented illegal migrants. So that data is not available, and it is this means that even for planning purposes, we have a black hole section, but are not part of the plans because they're not part of the official data that we have. So just a little bit to think about as an intermission, as we now move to Musaki, who, as I said before, will talk specifically about the work of her agency and a special group of refugees, journalists.
Good morning, everyone. I see that it's still morning, and thank you so much for organizing this, and to the previous speakers for sharing the very interesting insight. I hope you can hear me well.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So as Rita noted, I work with an organization called the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ in short. It is an NGO whose mission is to campaign for the freedom of journalists around the world to do their jobs in a safe environment. And I am based in Nairobi, obviously, and I oversee a lot of our work in the region. To begin with, I wanted to share a little bit about a facet of CPJ work. A lot of our work is research, it's advocacy, but we also do what we call assistance. And by assistance, we usually try to answer the question of what can we do now as we try to change the bigger picture. So, for example, if we are concerned that journalists are getting arrested, as we campaign for their release or as we campaign for laws to be changed, is there something that we could be doing now? So, for instance, seeing that they receive legal support or that they receive prison support. We keep track of the data of how many journalists we support globally every year, what kind of needs they come to us with. And I would like to share a statistic that we published actually in June 2020, in mid last year, that was looking at the data on the number of journalists that we'd supported around the world from January to June. So that's a period of 6 months. And we found that 64% of the cases of journalists where we'd supported with assistance of some sort, this could be a little bit of money to buy food or, funds to help settle in a new place, 64% of them were journalists who had fled their home countries. Now, this is data, again, from January to June in 2024, and I can share the report where this was included. But it just gives sort of a snapshot of the current global environment. And this is not unique to CPJ. If you look at other organizations that sort of work in a similar space, for instance, the France-based Reporters Without Borders, RSF, they've also released recent data noting that majority of the support that they're getting requests for is for people who are going to exile or for people who've been forced to flee home. So for us, the question of refugee rights intersects very closely with the freedom of journalists, just because we see that in many spaces, when the space for political freedom starts to narrow, when repression starts to happen, journalists are often at the front lines, reporting what's happening, but also among the first victims. Now, if we look at East Africa, I just wanted to speak about some quick trends that we see in terms of the movement of this specific community of journalists. I would note here that I'm going to use language in very broad ways. I'm going to talk about exiled journalists. They don't always apply for asylum. They don't always get refugee status because some of them move for a short while. Some of them move with other arrangements. So I would like to flag that I'm not talking specifically about people who've applied for refugee status or received it, but simply people who've been forced to flee their homes, so people in exile. And if we look at the East and Horn of Africa, we can see that the movement of journalists outside of their homes, countries, happen sometimes in waves. So some countries, due to a period of repression, we see high numbers of journalists going to exile. During times of political tension, particularly around contested elections, you might see journalists also fleeing. And what comes to mind for me here is, for instance, Tanzania, when John Pombe Magufuli was the president and really cracked down on the media. You did see higher than usual number of Tanzanian journalists trying to find safety elsewhere. This was unusual, at least for me as an observer of these trends, and is something that we haven't really seen in similar figures since then. Waves also because of conflict. So, for instance, we've always noted Ethiopian journalists going to exile in East Africa, sort of in like waves, and the most recent one that we documented for us was following the civil war in 2020, and we saw that in a period of 4 years, we as CPJ alone documented about 54 journalists to exile. Now that doesn't sound like a large figure when you consider the millions of refugees who are living outside of their home countries, but if you remember that this is a very specific community of professionals, a small community in most countries, and if you also consider the repercussions of just those 54 journalists, because you must remember these are families, but they also have repercussions on their communities. It's an editor who was editing like maybe a small community publication online that is no longer able to do that. So it has a ripple effect on entire communities. We can also see countries where we have sort of persistent streams, steady streams of journalists being forced to exile, and this is reflective of continued difficult conditions in those countries. And what comes to mind, for instance, is Somali journalists. There's a huge diaspora of Somali journalists in East Africa and beyond. I would also talk about Rwanda in this category, where I feel like the space has really been narrowed, and we have seen critical journalists, whether they're bloggers, YouTubers, etc., being forced to exile. But I want to note that sitting where I do in Nairobi, in recent years, it feels like there are also emergent concerns, bursts of conflict around us, whether this is what's happening in Sudan now, or in the DRC with what's happening in Goma, that suggests to me that the numbers of journalists going to exile are going to keep rising, unfortunately. That suggests to me that we're going to see continued need to support these individuals. What are the challenges? I feel like I'm going to be repeating already what the other speakers said, but I will sort of highlight it to say, yes, even here we see this. Documentation has already been mentioned repeatedly. This is a huge concern also. Ability to continue working in your chosen profession. Journalists go to exile and very few of them are able to continue doing their jobs. Now, some of them, because of the nature of the media work in the current world, where you can do things virtually, where you can report on any situation from across the world if you have internet access, the media community does have a bit of a privilege in comparison to other professions, because perhaps what you need to do is simply make phone calls, contact sources, and you're still able to do those stories. But the question is, can you do it safely? Do your sources trust you that now that they no longer see you? Do you have the same level of access that you used to do? And where are you going to sell this journalism? Because at the end of the day, you do need to earn an income from this. Are you still able to access the same kind of publications that you did before now that you're in exile? Are you able to find employment perhaps in local publications? And usually what we've seen is that this is incredibly, incredibly difficult. I also want to speak briefly about transnational repression, a growing concern, where we see that journalists, particularly those who maintain critical voices, even when they flee their homes, do not feel safe, and in some cases are in fact not safe. I want to share two examples. One is of an Ethiopian journalist who left his home country in 2023 following some quite public threats and intimations that he would get arrested. His name was Gobeze Sisai. A few days after fleeing Ethiopia, Gobeze was returned to Ethiopia from Djibouti. And the authorities issued very odd statements about how they had received support to arrest him. And it raised a number of questions. Was there an extradition process? What were the circumstances under which this person was arrested? Or was he essentially simply kidnapped? Gobeze is now in Ethiopia in prison, facing a potential death penalty if he's convicted for terrorism charges. Another example that I want to share is here in Kenya, more recent. I think if any of you are living in Kenya, you will have seen in mid-January, we had a prominent Tanzanian journalist and activist called Maria Sarungi Tsahai, abducted daytime in Nairobi on a Sunday, and driven around for about 4 hours in what we believe was an example of transnational repression. And there are fears that she would have been taken across the border to Tanzania had there not been a lot of public outcry. Now, these two examples simply tip of the iceberg. Journalists who speak to us tell us that they live in persistent fear, and particularly if they have prominent public profiles. If this person was like a well-known news anchor whose face is very recognizable, they don't feel safe even after they cross borders. And transnational repression can also happen digitally. I think many of you might be aware or might have seen the trends in the use of surveillance technology, specifically spyware, to target dissidents and critics around the world. And what we've seen is that this kind of spyware globally has been weaponized by governments to try and spy on, collect information about journalists who fled home and are perhaps, working safely elsewhere, and to use that information to intimidate them. Another element of transnational repression that we must recognize is that journalists sometimes, and many people who flee to exile, obviously do not bring their entire communities with them. And so we hear and we've seen efforts to silence journalists by threatening those that they leave at home, whether that's immediate family or distant family. And I believe that these trends can also be seen elsewhere. Now, in terms of mitigation, very briefly, for this specific community, there is work that is done, but it doesn't nearly go far enough. I spoke about our assistance work. We are part of a network called the Journalist in Distress Network, of similar-minded organizations that try to provide, assistance wherever they can. But an honest assessment of these systems reveals that they are quite overstretched, and often they're unable to do more than short-term type of support. And as you've heard from previous speakers, even the process of getting basic paperwork can take months. Resettlement can also take years. So you have that gap. I also spoke about livelihoods and communities, because we're speaking about a specific professional community here. There is opportunity for journalists to support each other through associations across borders. And we've seen some of this happen globally. When there was the American pullout from Afghanistan, we saw journalists going to Pakistan, and the press clubs there trying to step in and to do things to help them. Of course, that effort can be, analyzed critically several years down the line, but it was there. And we've seen similar efforts in the Americas. My humble opinion is that there's not nearly enough of that happening in Eastern Horn of Africa. There remains a huge gap of understanding, of solidarity, of brotherhood between communities of journalists who live in exile and communities of journalists in those host countries. And I believe that even efforts to try and get these two communities to simply speak to each other more, not even to say offer people a job, but simply say, here is a space, let's talk to each other, let me understand where you're coming from and what kind of situation you've left behind. And I'll tell you a little bit about my city. Maybe I can help you even with common basic things like how to use the Matatu system. Anyone who's come to Nairobi knows that this is something you need to learn. And I believe that those exchanges can do a lot to benefit, to provide safety, to provide a feeling of being valued, but I hope eventually to provide opportunities for continued livelihood. Transnational repression, we continue to push for accountability and investigation, but I believe this also suggests that those people who do support communities of journalists in exile must begin to think in non-traditional ways about where can we go, because I find that often communities tend to group together, and you understand why this happens. So you find a big community of Sudanese journalists, for instance, in a specific city in East Africa, and you understand why that happens. But then that also means that if there's someone trying to look for you or to threaten you, you are easier to find. What can we do on the African continent to find maybe non-traditional, non-expected places where people can go and be safe, perhaps be a little bit more anonymous? And this is particularly important in this moment where global politics is sending us a very strong message that even the very few difficult paths for resettlement of refugees that we had previously seem to be closing down, seem to be narrowing. So I think it's incredibly important to start thinking about what solutions exist within essentially the global south to keep high risk journalists in exile, but I think also this applies to political dissidents and who might face specific types of transnational repression. How do we keep them safe? And what always comes to mind for me when I think about this is I remember speaking to a journalist from East Africa who went to exile in Thailand. And that made a lot of sense for them because it was, no one is going to look for me here. For this specific person, it was a little bit easier to get that visa. And then from there, think about where else do I go? Now, a lot of these countries that we think about have their own human rights concerns, but I think a lot of this has to be about pragmatism, thinking about what we can do to keep people safe now as we think about what to do next. But at the bottom of it, I think communication, collaboration, thinking about who is already doing or providing the service that you need and how can you help them expand so that they can also serve your community is incredibly important. I think I went over my time, so I'm going to stop speaking. Thank you very much, Rita.
Thank you very much. I know you're right for time, and you raised a very important issue of transnational repression. It's very topical, and the incident that happened in May, I mean early this year in January, I should say, with the Tanzanian journalist is not the only experience here in Kenya, in Nairobi. If we go far back, we know that South Sudanese human rights activists were taken from Nairobi, and that in 2021 there was an Ethiopian person that was sort of taken not far in here also from Nairobi. We don't know much about. And then there are other colleagues and friends also that we all kind of know that have had similar experiences.
And I think it's also one of the most outrageous cases, of course, is the Pakistani journalist who was essentially assassinated by Kenyan police and for whom there has been no accountability.
Yeah. And so I'm sure, within our family as well, we know these situations. And then, these things don't happen in isolation, because also we have the experience of many of the young people of Kenya, the famous Gen Zs, also being abducted and disappeared. So, issues of impunity are not that, when they happen and they are let go, then they happen across the board with a number of communities, which comes back to the whole theme of Fratelli, Tutti, right? That we should not be standing alone. We should be standing together. And if something is not good, then we should step up, because sooner or later it will come around to all of us. I think we are now, maybe I can summarize a little bit before we open for questions, what the major conversations have been. Critical, of course, as all of our speakers have mentioned, is the issue of documentation. That takes years to finally get your refugee or aside, your refugee status and your ID cards. So that is very critical. Below that is, again, something we may not think about is the issue of the address. David maybe can speak more on it, but the 2021 refugee legislation in Kenya allows for people to live outside of the camp. And there are certain communities that prefer to live outside the camps, but get automatically allocated to the camps, which add to the problems. And in this case, I'm thinking of Eritreans, Ethiopians, and so on, but there are others. Because people don't live in the camp, then the issue of shelter, education, and medical assistance becomes a problem. It's a gap in that process. And yes, the legal petition is about fighting the Department of Refugee Services request or demand that refugees hand over their national passports. This is also, and this is an ongoing struggle, which involves a number of Kenyan civil society legal organizations. So now, and finally, the issue of transnational repression is real. It is active. And the saying is, just because I'm paranoid, it doesn't mean they're not trying to kill me. And it has to be taken seriously, because this action is also an infringement on Kenyan sovereignty. We are now open for the next 30 minutes or so for questions from the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, and all the presenters of this panel. You have raised quite a number of issues of current concern, and we are likely to see that some of these issues that we have raised are going to increase because of insecurity around us. And our previous speaker has already spoken about the situation in DRC and in other places. So we need to be prepared for that. Rita, you talked about, and I know that that's your field now, and your concern about database, and then documentation. Yeah. And here I would like to link up with a call from the nuncio yesterday, when he was giving a call to action. And one of the fourth one was an address to the academia. It was about research, documentation, and database. But of course, I mean, here the issues are different. But anyway, it goes into research and database and so on. And he was mainly talking about documenting about the positive impact of this particular community of refugees, displaced, and migrants, the contribution that they make to the local and host communities. They are always seen as a problem, yeah, but they really contribute a lot, and that has not been, documented. And documentation maybe could help also remove the fear and the stigma and so on, and allow easy integration into the host countries and the host communities. So that could maybe something that you could also consider with that network that you are creating, Rita and your group. Yeah. So here, research and documentation becomes really very, very, very important. Yeah. Not only of those refugees and the asylum seekers and protection and so on. Yeah, but also, yeah, the positive impact that, and then maybe also on that, once you have a strong, base, research-based evidence, then you can also push governments, to open, up their policies into welcoming and facilitating, these the community of displaced migrants and refugees. Of course, we are also talking about, journalists. This is a particular community. So let's go into interaction and some questions. I had seen Augustine from Uganda. I would have liked him to give on his own perspective, because he's also very, very much involved on the legal aspect, but he's not. I think he has already left the Zoom. Yeah. And of course, what you are talking about is really also touching. We've seen also some of our very, very close friends being abducted and then deported in here. We have seen prominent politicians being deported, abducted, and deported back to their country. So these are so this conference is really timely, and in the mind of the organizers, this is not just a conference like any other. We would like to pursue the conversation so that we can really make an impact. So we would be very much happy to receive an elaborate papers from you with a concrete point of action, so that we can build on that. A community, larger community that supports refugees, migrants, and displaced people, including also asylum seekers. So, questions. I don't know if there are comments online and questions online.
I'm trying to see if there are any.
Yeah.
Maybe you can assist me.
Okay. Yeah. Normally there is somebody online who has the rights to collect questions and answers or remarks.
I'm copy and pasting it to the chat so you can read it from chat. There's one.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. I can't see my. Okay. I can't see the chat.
Okay. Let me read it for you.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Rita, for the interesting and important discussion. What is the relationship of transnational repression regarding refugees in the region? How do you link this with documenting? That was the question.
Okay, thank you. I think I will like to ask the support of the panel in answering that question. Musoki, would you like to start, please?
Sure, no problem. I'll try my best. So I'm just looking at the question again. How do you link regarding what is the relationship? So I think what we're seeing, well, let's be clear. I don't think we should pretend that transnational repression is an entirely new thing. I just think that we're seeing it happening in places where we didn't expect to, with a frequency that we didn't expect, and we're also seeing different ways of operating, the interaction between transnational repression and the fact that we're also technologically connected, which makes journalists in exile and refugees in general more vulnerable in terms of their ability to be surveilled, their ability to be found. Now, there's an obvious link here, because if you're leaving home to seek safety, but the people that you've left behind are following you, then how will you ever be able to live a life of where you feel secure and one of dignity, where you're not constantly restricting your movements and not living, freely at all? How does it link with documenting? As Rita noted earlier, some of the cases that have been in the headlines have been just the ones that we know, and we all suspect this is the tip of a very big iceberg. We don't know fully what's happening to people in exile in the region, because not everything gets reported. Sometimes people are intimidated into silence. But if we consider how this interacts with the fact that not everyone in exile is registered as a refugee, and not everyone in exile is existing in a community where people keep track of you and actually will notice if something happens to you, that further suggests that the problem might then be far, far bigger than it is, because we don't have the necessary documentation of where everyone is and what they're doing, and not every single person is embedded in a community. Again, that can raise the alarm and say, we haven't seen this person in 5 days. That then suggests that the problem might be just much bigger than we think it is. And if we don't have that data, and if we don't have that documentation, it undermines efforts to respond, efforts to mitigate, whether that's through advocacy or whether through that's the development of safety protocols for very high risk people. Maybe someone else can contribute.
Deborah or David, would you like to step in on this issue?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. The problem with documentation, it is a big problem in this country. There is a backlog of very many asylum seekers who have not been registered. All the other problems notwithstanding, the issue is with the Department of Refugee Services. They're the ones who have failed to do their job. They're the ones who have failed to do what is required of them in regards to documentation. And that's why we are seeing these problems happening to asylum seekers. So about documentation, it is squarely within the scope of the government as the law provides, the Refugee Act 2021 and the Refugee General Regulations 2024. I think, I hope that answers part, or if not, your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that answers that particular question. But as we know, some states in our region are better than others at this transnational repression, and have a long history of doing this. So we know we have Rwanda. This is a case situation, and then the other one is Ethiopia, Eritrea also. they have a long history of doing this. And it also means that there are connections within, the institutions of in the region to facilitate this problem. Is there another question? I don't see any other question here.
No, that was it.
That was it. We finished early, and I apologize that one of our speakers couldn't make it at the end of the day. I think this is a very important initiative, and I really thank David and Musoki and Deborah for being here today and sharing with us. I am very thankful to Tangaza and Harmony Institute and the Fratelli Tutti conference for the opportunity to present these issues. And I hope that we will do more work on this in the future. I also thank the audience who has been listening to us patiently, and wish you a very, very good afternoon for the rest.